Good evening. That's the signal for silence. I'm Pat Zerke, the director of Cambridge Forum, and I am delighted to welcome you all here tonight on this snowy evening for a lively and fascinating conversation with Jared Diamond. So now I'm going to give it to Tim Weiskell, who will moderate the program for us tonight.
Thank you very much, Pat. Good evening and welcome to Cambridge Forum. Before the program begins, let me go through a few announcements here. Some of them you're familiar with. First, if you want to receive information about Cambridge Forum's future programs, please be sure to add your name, email, and mailing address and stuff like that on the list on the table when you came in. There's a list back there you can sign up for and sign in on. You can also find information there concerning membership in the Friends of Cambridge Forum, our support organization. Cambridge Forum has been presenting these public discussions in Harvard Square for 46 years. It's more than most of the commercial establishments in this town. Cambridge Forum has been part of that tradition because of the generosity of the citizens in the People's Republic of Cambridge, so please do consider becoming a member of the Friends of Cambridge Forum. As our friends are aware, Cambridge Forum is a participatory activity, and the audience assists by asking questions. Questions, not making long statements, but questions. We have, for that reason, a microphone in the middle of the aisle up here, and after the presentation is made and the initial questions are posed, you're welcome to line up and pose questions. Thanks to the Harvard Bookstore, we have copies of Jared Diamond's new book, The World Until Yesterday, which you know about, for sale after the program. They're for sale over here on the right, on my right, your left. And of course, he will be happy to sign, but doesn't have the capacity tonight because of all the people to do extensive comments on. We'll sign the book if you wish to purchase one. As you know, Cambridge Forum's public programs are recorded and then edited and produced as half-hour radio programs aired on a nationwide network of national public radio stations. CD copies of the programs are also available, and you can receive a copy of tonight's program, again, by signing up on the appropriate list on the back table. In addition, tonight's program will become part of the Forum network hosted by WGBH, where it will be available as a streaming webcast. Because our program is recorded, we ask you to come forward and use this microphone, not just to pop up and pop off wherever you are. That's not the point. You've got to be recorded, as it were. And for that reason, you are, in effect, acknowledging and giving permission for your treasured comments and the voice to be recorded by coming to the microphone. So it's not appropriate to sue us afterwards if you ask a question, right? Finally, since it is recorded, we really don't want to record your cell phones going off and alarms and the like, so please take this moment to turn them on vibrate or turn them off altogether for this exciting evening. All right, welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing the world until yesterday, what we can learn from traditional societies, or what can we learn from traditional societies? Put it as a question with Pulitzer Prize winning author Jared Diamond. I'm Tim Weiskell, a member of the Forum's board, and I'll be the moderator for this evening. His most personal book yet, best-selling author Jared Diamond reflects on the profound differences between so-called traditional societies and our modern industrialized societies. Differences in everything from the way we count to the way we meet strangers. As we meet and work with a whole series of new people from day to day, today's traditional societies may have a great deal of insight to share with us. Until yesterday means until very recently, in the long continuing of the relatively long period of human evolution. Some place it as long as 6 million years in hominid evolution since we departed in the evolutionary tree from our most closely related relatives, the chimpanzees. While we wouldn't want to give up running water or electricity, Diamond argues that we can still learn from traditional societies. What do they have to teach us? What can they help us by way of forging a better future world? Jared Diamond is professor of geography at UCLA, but he actually has a very broad range of interests. He's known for his academic work in evolutionary biology, ornithology, environmental history, and linguistics. Among his many awards, the National Medal of Science, Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement, Japan's Cosmos Prize, and a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, as well as the Lewis Thomas Prize, honoring the scientist as poet, presented by Rockefeller University. Diamond's previous books include Why is Sex Fun?, The Third Chimpanzee, Collapse, and Guns, Germs, and Steel, which won the Pulitzer Prize. His latest book, The World Until Yesterday, serves as the basis of our discussion this evening. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Jared Diamond.
Let me first check whether you'll be able to hear me in back and up there. Can you hear? Can you hear okay? It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Boston, the city where I was born and grew up, and back in Cambridge, where I was an undergraduate and postdoc, and it's also a mixed pleasure for me to re-encounter snow and slush, in which I spent 26 years of my life, but we don't have it in Los Angeles. First, to give me an idea how many of you here this evening may find what I'm about to tell you of practical interest, I'm going to ask you to raise your hands in either of two groups. Could you please raise your hand if you are either over age 65, or if you hope to live past age 65, or if you have a parent or grandparent who live past 65? Raise your hands, please. Lots of you. Those are the people here who may find my talk this evening of practical value. Now, let me ask you to raise your hand if you are under 65, have no intention of living past 65, and have no parent or grandparent who live past 65. Raise your hand, please. Anyone in that category will find my talk of no practical relevance, but I think you'll find it nevertheless fascinating. The subject that I'm going to talk about constitutes just one chapter of my latest book, which compares traditional small tribal societies with our big modern societies with respect to many aspects of society, such as the status of old people, bringing up children, health, dealing with danger, settling disputes, war, religion, and speaking more than one language. Tribal societies, which constituted all human societies for most of human history, are far more diverse than are our modern big societies. All big societies that have governments and where most people are strangers to each other, as I am to you this evening, are similar to each other and different from tribal societies in many basic ways, regardless of whether our big societies are American, German, Chinese, or Israeli. Tribes constitute, in effect, thousands of natural experiments in how to organize a human society. They constitute experiments from which we ourselves might be able to learn. Tribal society shouldn't be scorned as primitive and miserable, but also they shouldn't be idealized as happy and peaceful. When we learn of tribal practices, some of them are going to horrify you, but there are other tribal practices which, when we hear about them, we may admire and envy and wonder whether we could adopt these practices for ourselves. To get some perspective how we treat elderly people in modern Western societies, let me tell you the opinion of a friend of mine from the Fiji archipelago who had visited the US. There are some things that my Fijian friend admired about the US, other things that he disliked, but what he most loathed about the US was our treatment of older people. He almost shouted at me indignantly, "You Americans throw away your old people." By that he meant that most old people in the US end up living separately from their children and separately from their friends of their earlier years, and often live in separate retirement homes for the elderly. In Fiji and in other traditional societies, older people instead live out their lives among their children, their other relatives, and their friends. Nevertheless, the treatment of the elderly varies enormously among traditional societies, from much worse to much better than in our modern societies. At the worst extreme, many traditional societies get rid of their elderly in one of 5 increasingly direct ways: by not feeding them until they die, by abandoning them when the group moves on, by encouraging them to commit suicide, by killing them with their own cooperation, or by killing them without their consent or cooperation. In what tribal societies do children abandon or kill their parents? It happens mainly under 2 sets of conditions. One is in nomadic hunter-gatherer societies that often shift camp and that are physically incapable of transporting old people who can't walk, when the able-bodied younger people already have to carry the young children and all of their physical possessions. The other condition for abandoning or killing old people is in societies living in marginal or fluctuating environments, such as the Arctic or deserts, where there are periodic food shortages, and occasionally there just isn't enough food to keep everybody alive. Whatever food is available has to be reserved for able-bodied people still capable of contributing to the tribe's survival, and to children who grow up to be the tribe's future adults. To us modern Americans, it sounds horrible to think of abandoning or killing your own sick spouse or elderly parent. But what else could those societies do? They face a cruel choice. Their old people had to do it to their own parents, and the old people know what now is going to happen to them. At the opposite extreme is the treatment of the elderly in the happy extreme. New Guinea farming societies, where I've been doing my field work for the past 50 years, and the village society, my Fijian friend, and other sedentary traditional societies around the world. In those societies, older people are cared for, they're fed, they remain valuable, and they continue to live in the same hut or a nearby hut near their children, relatives, and lifelong friends. There are 2 sets of reasons for this variation among societies in their treatment of old people. The variation depends partly on the usefulness of older people and partly on the society's values. First, as regards usefulness, older people continue to perform useful services in many traditional societies as in our modern societies. Older people may still be effective at producing food in hunter-gatherer or simple farming societies. They may babysit their grandchildren, thereby freeing up their own adult children, the parents of the grandchildren, to go out hunting and gathering food for the grandchildren. They're typically the people who are best at making tools, weapons, baskets, pots, and textiles. Older people are usually the leaders of traditional societies and the people most knowledgeable about medicine, religion, politics, songs, and dances. To some extent, that's still true today. The average age of American presidents, on assuming the presidency, is 54 years. And finally, older people in traditional societies have one more huge significance that would never occur to us in our modern literate societies, where the sources of information are books and the internet. In contrast, in traditional societies, without writing, older people are the repositories of information. It's their knowledge, the knowledge of older people, that spells the difference between survival and death for their whole society in a time of crisis caused by rare events of which only the older people have had experience. So, those are the ways in which older people are useful in traditional societies. Their usefulness varies among traditional societies and contributes to variation in the society's treatment of the elderly. The other set of reasons for variations in treatment of the elderly is the society's cultural values, which vary somewhat independently of the youthfulness of the elderly. For example, among big societies that have had centralized governments for thousands of years, there's particular emphasis on respect for the elderly in East Asia, associated with the philosophy of Confucius and his doctrine of filial piety, which means obedience, respect, and support for elderly parents. Cultural values that emphasize respect for older people, such as Confucian filial piety, contrast with the low status of the elderly in the United States. Older Americans are at a disadvantage in getting jobs. For example, a sociologist at Boston University carried out the experiment of submitting dozens of job applications in response to ads by prospective employers. All of the applications gave fictitious names of women, and all of the applications were identical, except that half of the applications gave the woman's age as 25 to 40, and the other half of the applications gave her age as 45 to 60. The result of the experiment was that employers were twice as likely to call a woman aged 25 to 40 for a job interview as a woman aged 45 to 60. Another example of the low status of the elderly in the U.S. is an explicit policy in our hospitals called age-based allocation of health care resources. That expression is a cruel euphemism. It means that if hospital resources are limited, for example, if there's only a certain number of hospital beds available, or if there's only one donor heart available for transplant, or if a surgeon has time to operate only a certain number of people, American hospitals have the explicit policy of giving preference to younger patients over older patients on the grounds that younger patients are more valuable to society because they have more years of life ahead of them, even though the younger patients have fewer years of valuable life experience behind them. There are several reasons for this low status of the elderly in the U.S. The high status of the elderly in East Asia is based on the Asian emphasis on filial piety. The low status of elderly Americans arises from several American values that replace filial piety. One is our Protestant work ethic, which places high value on work, so older people who are no longer working are no longer valued. Another reason is our American emphasis on the virtues of self-reliance and independence, so we instinctively scorn older people who are no longer self-reliant and independent. And still a third reason is our American cult of youth, which shows up even in our advertisements for Coca-Cola and beer. They always depict smiling young people, even though old people as well as young people buy Coke and beer. What's the last time that you saw a Coca-Cola or a beer ad depicting smiling people 75 or 80 years old? I'm sure never. The only American ads featuring white-haired old people are ads for retirement homes, pension planning, and adult diapers. Well, what has changed in the status of the elderly today compared to their status in traditional societies? There have been a few changes for the better and more changes for the worse. Big changes for the better include the facts that today we enjoy much longer lives, much better health in our old age, and much better recreational opportunities. Another change for the better is that we now have specialized retirement facilities and programs to take care of our old people. Changes for the worse begin with the cruel reality that we now have far more old people and fewer young people than at any time in the past. This means that all those old people are more of a burden on the few young people, and that each old person has less individual value. Another big change for the worse is the status of the elderly is the breaking of social ties with age, because older people and their children and their friends all move and scatter independently of each other many times during their lives. The average American moves every 5 years. Hence, our older people are likely to end up living distant from their children and from the friends of their youth. Yet another change for the worse in the status of the elderly is formal retirement from the workforce, carrying with it a loss of work friendships and a loss of the self-esteem associated with work. Perhaps the biggest of all changes for the worse in the status of our elderly is that they are objectively less useful. They've lost some of their usefulness in traditional societies. Widespread literacy means that They, that's to say older Americans, are no longer useful as repositories of knowledge. When we want some information, we go look it up in a book or we Google it instead of, as a New Guinean, finding some old person to ask. Then the slow pace of technological change in traditional societies means that what someone learns there as a child is still useful when that person is old. But the rapid pace of technological change today means that what we learn as children is no longer useful 60 years later, and we older people aren't fluent in the technologies essential for surviving in modern American society. For example, as a 15-year-old high school student here in Boston, I was considered outstandingly good at multiplying numbers because I'd memorized the multiplication tables, I know how to use logarithms, and I'm quick at manipulating a slide rule. Today, though, skill at multiplying multiplication tables and at logarithms and at slide rules is utterly useless because any idiot can multiply 8-digit numbers accurately and instantly with a pocket calculator. Conversely, I, at age 75, am incompetent at skills essential for everyday American life. My family's first television set that we acquired in 1948 when television was ushered into Boston had only 3 knobs that I quickly mastered. We had an on-off switch, we had a volume knob, and we had a channel selector knob. Today, just to watch a TV on the television set in my own living room, I have to operate a 41-button TV remote that I find utterly confusing. To watch television, what I have to do is to phone up my 25-year-old sons and ask them to talk me through it while I try to push those wretched 41 buttons. What can we do to improve the lives of the elderly in the US and to make better use of their value? That's a huge problem. In my remaining few minutes today, I can offer you just a few suggestions. One value of older people is that they are increasingly useful for offering high-quality child care as more and more younger women enter the workforce and as fewer young parents stay home as full-time caretakers of their children. Compared to the usual alternatives of paid babysitters and daycare centers, grandparents offer superior, motivated, experienced child care if that's what they wish to do. They've already gained experience from raising their own children. They usually love their grandchildren, and they're eager to be permitted to spend time with their grandchildren. Unlike other caregivers, grandparents don't quit their jobs because they found another job with higher pay or more Social Security and medical benefits. A second value of older people is paradoxically related to their loss of value as a result of changing world conditions and technology. At the same time, older people have gained in value today precisely because of their unique experience of former conditions that have now become rare because of rapid change, but that could come back. For example, only older Americans now in their 70s or older today can remember the experience of living through a Great Depression, the experience of living through a world war, the experience of living through food and gas rationing. Most of our current voters and politicians have no personal experience of any of those things, but millions of older Americans do. Unfortunately, all of those terrible situations could come back. Even if they don't come back, we have to be able to plan for them on the basis of the experience of what they were like. Older Americans have that experience. Younger Americans, including younger American politicians, don't. The remaining value of older people that I'll mention today recognizes that while there are many things that older people can no longer do, there are other things that they can do much better than younger people. A challenge for our society is to make use of those things that older people are better at doing. Some abilities, of course, decrease with age. Those abilities include abilities at tasks requiring physical strength and stamina, ambition, and the power of novel reasoning in a narrowly circumscribed situation, such as figuring out the structure of DNA best left to scientists under the age of 30. Conversely, valuable attributes that increase with age include experience, understanding of people and human relationships, ability to help other people without your own ego getting in the way, and interdisciplinary thinking about large databases, such as biogeography and comparative history, best left to scholars over the age of 60, or best of all to scholars over the age of 75. Hence, older people are better than younger people at supervising, administering, advising, strategizing, teaching, and synthesizing. I've seen this value of older people with so many of my friends in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, friends who are still active at that age as farmers, lawyers, and surgeons. In short, many traditional societies make better use of their elderly and give their elderly more satisfying lives than we do in modern big societies. Paradoxically, nowadays, when we have more elderly people than ever before, living healthier lives and with better medical care than ever before, old age is in some respects more miserable than ever before. The lives of the elderly are widely recognized as constituting a disaster area of modern American society. We can surely do better by learning from the lives of the elderly in traditional societies. What's true of the lives of the elderly in traditional societies, which constitutes just one chapter of my book, is true of many other features of traditional societies as well. Of course, I'm not advocating that we all give up agriculture and metal tools, that we return to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, live in small tribes, and resume making war against neighboring tribes. There are some obvious respects in which our lives today are far happier than lives in small traditional societies. To mention just a few examples, our lives are longer, they're materially much richer, and they're less plagued by violence than are the lives of people in traditional societies. But there are also things to be admired about people in traditional societies and perhaps to be learned from them. Their lives in traditional societies are usually socially much richer than our lives, although materially poorer. Their children, the children of traditional people, are usually more self-confident, more independent, more socially skilled, more precocious than are our children. They, in traditional societies, essentially never die of diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, stroke, and the other non-communicable diseases that are going to be the causes of death of most of us here in this room today. That's not just because they, in traditional societies, don't live long enough to get diabetes and those other diseases. Even when compared at the same age, people living traditional lifestyles are far less likely to get diabetes and heart disease and those other non-communicable diseases than are Americans of the same age. Features of the modern lifestyle predispose us to those diseases, and features of the traditional lifestyle protect us against those diseases. Those are just some examples of what we can learn from traditional societies. I hope that you'll find it as fascinating to read in my book about the legacies of traditional societies as I found it to live in those societies. Well, I was asked to keep my prepared remarks down to 20 minutes, and that gives us lots of time for questions and enthusiastic approval on your part. Yes.
You are joining us at Cambridge Forum listening to Jarrett Diamond discussing the world until yesterday. What can we learn from traditional societies? I'll begin with a question or two, and then we'll open it up to the hall. First question is, what constitutes traditional? In many respects, I was drawn to the descriptions you had here, very eloquently put forward, but a lot that presents itself as traditional, for example, peasant societies, in parts of the world not touched upon here, say Europe, or in large kingdoms, say in Asia that you referred to in passing in your comments. These are not categorized, as it were, in traditional society. Yet many would argue that it's in those societies we may learn the greatest amount, for after all, it's among peasant societies where agriculture has been established sometimes for thousands of years that communities have learned to live on the solar throughput. One thing which we might learn from them in an enormous contributive manner, that is to say, we've now made our agriculture depend on fossilized solar throughput. And we're forgetting the great insight that, in a sense, is also left out of your book about collective wisdom in technology. I'm curious as to what you might reflect upon. The groups that you studied, certainly in New Guinea, were agriculturalists and made use of solar throughput energy. But what you focus upon is, in a sense, highly individualized pieces of information about how to treat the young, how to treat the old, how to be nurtured by a multilingual context and the like. What about collective wisdom from this other kind of traditional culture?
Sure. As to what is a traditional society, of course, there's an entire spectrum from small-scale hunter-gatherer societies to modern states with populations of up to 1.6 billion. Traditional societies could naively be described as those societies existing until 11,000 years ago, when many societies started to get modified by agriculture. So traditional societies run a spectrum from societies of a few dozen, a band of hunter-gatherers, societies of a few hundred, who may be foragers, or they may be small-scale farmers, societies of a few thousand that would be called a chiefdom, societies of up to tens of thousands that could be called a simple state, and then the large modern industrial states. A friend of mine, a New Guinea friend of mine, suggested for this reason that one should speak not of traditional societies, but transitional societies, because in fact all societies in the modern world, even societies in the most remote parts of New Guinea and the Amazon, have been modified by the modern world or by knowledge of the modern world. Even if they haven't had first contact, they may already have acquired pots and steel tools. And even if they haven't acquired any of that stuff, they now have the knowledge that there's an outside world because they've seen the airplanes flying overhead. Whereas in New Guinea, as of 1931 and 1938, they didn't even know that there was an outside world. So that's the spectrum from traditional to modern. And in particular, when you mention farming societies, the great majority of the societies that I've worked with in New Guinea are small-scale farming societies. Foragers, hunter-gatherers are the minorities of people in New Guinea, mainly in the lowlands and in some fringe areas of the hills. As for the things that one can learn from traditional societies, a occupational hazard of an author who wants to write a book on a large subject, such as societies, is that there are lots of things to write about in societies. And if I had written about everything, I would have had an encyclopedia 30,000 pages long, costing $7,232, which nobody would buy or read. And that means that I had to select. I've selected on various criteria, but when you select, you then are exposed to the hazard of the reviewer who says, he selected this, but he left out my favorite subject. There have been reviewers that complain that I left out gender relations. It's true. I left out art. It's true. I left out marriage. It's true. To which I can only say I had to select and be grateful that I left out those subjects, because the result is that my book is 499 pages and affordable rather than colossal and unaffordable.
Very good. Well, one of the things that is the result of that selection is that we tend to idealize, in many respects, relationships that are generalized. And the problem with that is that, as Yogi Berra used to remind us, nostalgia ain't what it used to be. In other words, most of us are thinking back already upon an encounter that occurred in a different time. Now, this is a bit kind of inside baseball for anthropologists in a way, but anthropologists and cultural geographers like yourself spent time in these cultures at another time. To put it another way, we're encountering, say, in the Western Sahara and in Mali today, or last week on the bridges between Ottawa and Ontario and the United States, indigenous populations who are speaking in the name of tradition in very political terms. When do we choose to listen to political messages as opposed to, say, information about child rearing and insight about how we treat our elders. And when do we say, well, that's political, not traditional?
Speaking about traditional people at another time, my work in New Guinea began in 1964. My last trip to those islands was several months ago, and my next trip to the island will be the month after next. So much of what I write about New Guinea in my book, some of it is based on 40, 50 years ago, but a lot of it is based on recently. Things have changed. Some things have persisted, other things have changed. But among my New Guinea friends, I've talked with New Guineans who made the last stone tools in the area, made the last trip to the stone quarry. I've talked with some of my New Guinea friends have participated in the last of the tribal wars. And there's still lots of treatment of children. I would say most of the treatment of children in villages is similar to this in New Guinea, is similar to the treatment of children in villages described by people who were going into New Guinea 50 years ago.
Okay, well, now the floor is open for questions from the audience. Please make your way to the center microphone here so your comments can be recorded, and keep them to questions rather than long statements. Okay? Après vous, Alphonse.
Sorry, yes.
There we
First
go.
of all, Mr. Diamond, thank you so much for coming. Long-time reader, enjoyed everything you've written. So the first thing I want to say is that, as my father would say, Lapunim diamonim long pela im strong pela tumas. I was conceived in New Guinea. My father was a Kiap and patrol officer and an education officer there.
Could you speak up? I'm having difficulty hearing
So
you,
sorry.
please.
I'm shy. Just going to say, as my father would say, Lapunim diamond im strong pela tumas. I've enjoyed everything you've written. My father was a patrol officer and education officer in New Guinea from 1954, Manus Island, Hagen, and so forth. And I'm just going to reflect on something that he came back to me with, which his experience in New Guinea over a 15-year period as a very, very retail level administrator, government official, and so forth. He came back with the abiding conclusion that cultures are the sum of people, and that many of the lessons that you're trying to bring to us, and which I frankly absorb completely on a personal level, aren't so much a consequence, and this would be, again, channeling him, of the cultures from which the individuals came, as much as it was a reflection of the individuals in those cultures with whom he had contact. And I'm just reflecting on that perhaps what you're urging, what you're suggesting, is less a cultural lesson, less an anthropological lesson, as much as it is a personal moral lesson. We should take advantage of our elders. We should call on them, regardless of our own sort of personal inhibitions, to give childcare, to give advice, to give counsel. I'm a mathematician. I work with, I wouldn't say I work with, but I have a collection of mentors to whom I turn for advice about how to manage people, less because of the culture I'm from, and more, in a sense, because of my father's experience in New Guinea 60 years ago, where he learned of the importance of mentoring and the importance of taking value from individuals as an education officer. Just wondering about a response to that.
They're interesting comments, but I'm having difficulty distilling them down into a question to which I can respond. Perhaps you can condense them.
Well, the question was very succinctly put in terms of, is this a moral lesson that we would learn about how individuals ought to relate to one another, rather than a specific behavioral pattern that we might learn from within the culture? In other words, and you could generalize it beyond perhaps what he intended, but what's interesting in face-to-face societies is the way people learn to treasure one another and learn from one another. And that's, in a sense, a moral lesson, independent of the cultural lessons from specific societies, one to another.
I don't think that one can pigeonhole the sorts of things that one can learn from traditional societies, because as with any human institutions, they cover a whole spectrum. You can learn from the things that individual people do. I've had some dramatic experiences in New Guinea where one New Guinean behaved in a certain way. One New Guinean, I remember spending an hour examining a stick in the ground to try to figure out whether that stick had fallen out of a tree and meant nothing, or whether the stick had been planted in the ground by landowners, in which case we were in deep trouble. I was strongly influenced by a small group of New Guineans, about 6 of them, who did not want to camp under a big tree. It was a dead tree, and I learned about the importance of paying attention to rare events. I've learned from the behaviors of entire societies in New Guinea on how they deal with conflict. So there's a whole spectrum of things that one can learn either from individuals or cultures. There's a spectrum of things that you can incorporate into your everyday life, such as to be very careful standing in the shower in the morning, and things that your entire society has to adopt and that you can't incorporate yourself. For example, if you want to reduce the salt in your diet, yes, you can get the salt shaker off your table, but you have to persuade government to work with food manufacturers to get the salt out of the processed food in the supermarket. So, broad spectrum that can't be pigeonholed.
Thank you. I have a general question about your experiences. Over the course of your research, did you encounter any aspects of traditional societies that, although very good, could not by definition be incorporated into or learned from modern societies without us losing what makes us a modern society? And to clarify that, using an analogy, although there are many admirable aspects of religion, science, some of them cannot be incorporated into science without losing what makes science science, empiricism.
That's an interesting question. The various difficulties that we encounter in incorporating things from traditional societies, and I'm going to think out loud and see if I can lead up to an answer to your question. I may get 70% of the way, but may not give the answer. There are some things in traditional societies that you can easily adopt for yourself, regardless of what other people do. For example, most traditional small-scale societies don't spank their children. And that may be one of the things that contribute to the sense of security and independence and making their own decisions that is frequently commented upon in children in traditional societies. You can decide you're not going to spank your children regardless of what your neighbor's doing. So that's easy to adopt. There are some things in traditional societies that you might like to adopt, but that are difficult to adopt because it requires action on the part of the entire American society. For example, traditional societies are good at resolving disputes by negotiation and finding emotional reconciliation rather than the American style of hiring lawyers, suing, determining right or wrong, and being angry or churned up for the rest of your life. There are some things that you can do if you have a dispute with your neighbor, but if you have a car accident in the United States, you cannot handle that as would a New Guinean by trying to negotiate with the other party. The police get involved. So there's a case where if you want change in the United States to incorporate some of the admirable features of New Guinea dispute resolution, it's got to be done in terms of our legal system. And there are efforts. There's a movement called restorative justice that tries to get some elements of dispute resolution in traditional societies into the American justice system. And then the treatment of the elderly. There are big problems in treating the elderly in American society that require changes in American society. I'll give you a specific example. My father was a professor at Harvard, and he retired in 1968 at the age of 66, not voluntarily, but because Harvard in those days had a mandatory retirement policy. Mandatory retirement policies were widespread in American universities until a couple of decades ago, and yet older academics often still want to work. They have long experience, they're often creative. In my father's case, he moved to University of California and continued to teach and see patients until he was 93 years old. So here's a case where one cannot do something as an individual if your society has laws that make implementing it impossible. So that's a long-winded answer to say that, again, there's a spectrum. There are things that you can do regardless of the rest of society. There are things that require, though, changes in society, and in some cases, laws on the part of governments. Long-winded, but I think I've got it there.
one of the ways you mentioned in which elderly people could be valued or used by society is in childcare. Now, Scandinavian countries, Northern European countries have social policies in place that make it, that facilitate and even make it mandatory for parents to spend more time with their children, especially when young. So I am wondering if you think, I would like to see such policies implemented in this country, but you seem to suggest that maybe that's going down a dead end. And I wanted to ask you how you would see, legally and societally, how do we implement this involvement of elderly people in childcare? It's not going to be just a voluntary thing, family by family, I assume, but there's going to be social policies that make it easier, that remunerate, I don't know, whatever you have in mind.
Good example. So childcare by older people. Some of it you can do yourself. There are many of our friends of my wife's and my age, who are grandparents and who are devoting time to their grandchildren. There are also cases, as you mentioned in Europe, there's more social support and legal support for parents to take off time for child care. That's much less frequent in the United States, but we have a number of friends where maternity leave in the United States on the part of their businesses or universities has been extended to either parent. So good friends of ours in Los Angeles, it's the father who decided to stay home for 6 months and do child care rather than the mother. But that requires a policy on the part of the employer that leaves that option open. In short, here again we have an example of things that you can do as individuals and things that require institutions and permissions and laws on the part of society.
Thank you. I just don't have specific questions so much as things that I heard you say that maybe you could comment on, elaborate on. The declining number of young people in this society in proportion to older people is true, I think, in Japan, in Western Europe, even I think in Russia. So in other words, there's a kind of industrialized global culture where that's happening, but there's also I think, reverse in parts of the Middle East, Africa, where it's actually hugely increasing proportion of younger people. Yet, I would ask you, or I'm just throwing this out, are they not also part of this global, modern, or relatively industrialized nations? And so I wonder how that's going to play out, almost like an equation, like a mirror to what you were saying about the U.S. versus, say, New Guinea. One other thing I just wanted to mention, because I think it connects, whether it's directly to the treatment of older people or, as I think, to all of us, is that you said, well, one of the advantages, I think you put it, of a society like ours compared to a more traditional hunter-gatherer society is that we are subject to less violence than they are. But I just want to throw out, I guess maybe it's a cliche, I'm sorry if it is, but in my lifetime, and I grant that you've got about 11 years on me, I think as an American, we export violence. And so even though we kind of don't turn it on ourselves as directly, I think that really, in a way, the other side of exporting violence is that we internalize a kind of social, psychological, cultural repression. So I was just wondering if you could somehow comment on both of those things, because I think there's some connection there.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
You've mentioned two large issues, relations between the relative proportions between young and old population and the issue of violence. Given the finite time and that there are other people who have things that they want to discuss, let me comment on one of those two things, the relation between the young population and the old population. In rich industrial countries of the world, the birth rate is falling and the survival of people is rising, so that the ratio of old people to young people is increasing. And as you point out, that's extreme in Japan. On the other hand, there are countries in the developing world where, because of medical care, there's an explosion of young people, and things such as the AIDS epidemic have prevented that being translated into increased survival of old people. So in different parts of the world, the ratio of young people to old people is going different ways. In Japan and in Europe and in the US, where the ratio of old people to young people is going up, that has several consequences. It means that there are more old people to be cared for by fewer young people. It means that there are more old people drawing Social Security benefits with fewer young people contributing to Social Security benefits. And it's widely recognized that our Social Security system has funding problems in the long run because of those demographic reasons. It's also the case that with the state of the American economy today, more and more older people are finding it economically necessary to continue working, at the same time as more and more older people would like to continue working. In short, there's a mixture of things going on there.
And we're not the only ones. Apparently there was a much publicized birthday of two individuals, man and wife, 100 years old, born on the same day in China. BBC ran an article on it, celebrated their 100th birthday on the same day, and surrounded by grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren, all living in the same household. And the BBC reporter at the end of the story commented that there will be in excess of 1 million cases in the next 50 years of people in excess of 100 years old. That is, China is aging as a population. And when that dependency ratio changes between those contributing to incomes and those drawing upon them, it's going to be a global circumstance as life expectancy extends and the reproduction rate drops in industrialized areas. In any case, this is the kind of shift demographically, sociologically, that's going to be experienced increasingly, while at the same time, third world population growth is taking place most voluminously in the peasant cultures where child labor is most demanded and useful. So it's an extraordinary transition we're aiming for. Sir.
Professor Diamond, I was wondering, as far as the treatment of the elderly goes, the difference between the East and the West, is that not because of the Occidental emphasis on individualism, whereas in the East, for better or for worse, the community sort of always is placed before the individual. So that puts some onus and responsibility on people to look after the elderly. So I was wondering, is this a difference then between traditional and modern, or is this a difference between the cultural tendencies of the West and the East?
Good question. Question about the emphasis, different emphasis on the individual versus the community in the East and West, or in traditional versus modern societies. In the traditional societies with which I've experienced, and I think this is widespread, in small-scale traditional societies, there is an emphasis on the community and a de-emphasis on the individual. For example, in the New Guinea societies of which I have experience, it is difficult for an individual New Guinean embedded in his village of a few hundred people to get a job and become richer and get ahead, because the expectations of the community are that a member of the community is going to share what he earns with other members of the community. So it's difficult for an individual to advance himself without sharing his wealth with the community. As for the differences between the West and East, a problem here is that we often overgeneralize about the West on the one hand and the East on the one hand, and the East is incredibly diverse, just as the West is also diverse. It is the case, I understand, that in those parts of East Asia heavily influenced by the Confucian philosophy of filial piety, there is an emphasis on certainly the family, but it's also the case in Europe, in the Mediterranean, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, so-called patriarchal societies invest power in the oldest male of the household, But the unit is the family, not the individual. The family lives together in southern Italy and in Mexico. And the emphasis, as in small-scale traditional societies, is on the good of the family rather than on the good of the individual.
This basic question that you had so long ago from Yali about distribution of cargo, how does that question relate to this, to this kind of idea and the ill distribution of cargo and where it ends up?
Yeah. So the question is that my book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, began with Yali's question. Yali was a New Guinean who asked me, why is it that you white people came to New Guinea and brought lots of cargo, that stuff, whereas we New Guineans had little. And that was what triggered off my thinking that resulted in the book Guns, Germs, and Steel. The relation between Yali's question and the question of why history has unfolded differently on different continents and my current book. The relation is that both of those books are by the same author, but the books, I'm serious, but the books themselves are on entirely different subjects. So Yali's question does not come directly into my current book, except that Yali's question, namely why history unfolded differently in different continents, explains why in modern times there were still largely traditional people using stone tools in the mountains of New Guinea, but not in Europe. That's the relationship. Thanks for asking the question. Yeah.
Hi. So your account stresses the differences in status between old people in the West and in traditional societies or the East. But there's a counter-narrative which is about economic and political power. And old people have never had as much economic and political power as they do today. I mean, just to take one example, when Paul Ryan proposed turning Medicare into a premium support system, he chose to exempt people over the age of 55. So if you're over the age of 55, you'd have the guarantee of the same health care. If you were under 55, you would not. Support for the elderly is going to take up a growing share of the federal budget, going to increase federal debt. And the elderly are an extremely important political vote bank, more so than they've ever been before. So aren't the elderly actually more powerful in the United States than they ever have been previously?
Good point. The question of whether the older people in the United States have more power than ever before. From a certain point of view, older people have more power than they did 30 years ago because they're better organized. They have effective organizations like ARPA, I believe, which I and they're a vocal political force, which I take to mean that older people are not helpless. But they've organized in groups such as ARPA precisely because the situation of the old people is overall so unfortunate in the United States compared to traditional society. Yes, they're organizing politically and they're lobbying, but the fact is that the life of older people in the United States is socially more impoverished than in traditional societies. And one American friend of mine, who's an anthropologist, who works in West Africa, in the Central African Republic, and has long experience of traditional societies in the CAR, summarized it for me by saying, life in Africa is socially much richer, although materially poorer, than life in the United States.
I had a request for a clarification and then a question. I'm hoping you can elaborate a little bit more on how you're distinguishing traditional societies or traditional communities from indigenous people. And if I understood, can you have a traditional society or that adopts new technologies, or is it only hunter-gatherer? And if you could just clarify how you distinguish those two, traditional society versus indigenous or aboriginal. And I guess the question I'd have, is there anything in your experiences and research that we might learn from traditional societies in their social contract with the environment, both their social contract and their individual behavior that might move us beyond stereotypes of savages and noble savages?
Right. Let me take those interesting questions. Let me take them in reverse order. Second question about what we can learn from their social contract as regards, say, their management of their environmental resources. Outstanding work in that area was done by the the famous economist Ellen Ostrom, who died a year or so ago, and who got her Nobel Prize basically for working out why is it that some societies, particularly some small-scale traditional societies, succeed in managing their environmental resources sustainably, while others fail to do so and end up destroying their resources. And Ellen Ostrom's conclusions were that, to summarize a lifetime of Nobel Prize-winning work in one sentence, her conclusions were that societies are more likely to manage their resources sustainably if they are able to hold those resources for themselves and exclude outsiders on the one hand, and on the other hand, if they have the confidence that they will succeed in passing on their resources to their children. If they think that those resources will be passed to their children, and if they can exclude outsiders, then they have the motivation to manage their resources sustainably. Whereas if their resources are not going to get passed to their kids, and if there's no way that they can exclude outsiders, then realistically, the best policy for them is to grab those resources and destroy them before other people destroy them. So that's question number 2. Question number 1 about relation between traditional and indigenous. Indigenous is a term usually applied to peoples that were in that area 500 years ago. It's a matter of definition. The people in north of the Fish River in South Africa 2,000 years ago were San people. The people north of the Fish River in modern times are Bantu people. Who is indigenous north of the Fish River? Depends upon the time scale that one takes. So that's indigenous. And similarly, for Indonesia, who are the indigenous people of Indonesia? Are they the modern Indonesians speaking Bahasa Indonesia, Austronesian people, or are they people related to New Guineans who were largely swept away with the Austronesian expansion of 2000 BC into Indonesia and left just in a few pockets? So that's indigenous. Traditional, going back to your question, traditional means loosely people living with a lifestyle retaining much of what lifestyle was like up to 11,000 years ago, but people around the world have been influenced by changes since 11,000 years ago. And so traditional in Central America would mean farming people. Traditional in West Africa would mean farming people, although farming arose in West Africa 3000 BC. And yet farmers in West Africa one could call traditional, but as you pointed out, they've been influenced by the slave trade and by colonization over the last hundreds of years. This goes back then to the comment of my New Guinea friend that one should not refer to traditional people, but to transitional people, because all traditional peoples today have been influenced to greater or lesser degrees by the modern world.
So you spent the bulk of your lecture talking about the treatment of the elderly, and I assume that was because you find it to be the most important topic that we could learn from about traditional societies. What would you say is the second most important topic of the broad topics you've covered in the book?
You mentioned what you see as the first most important topic covered in my book, and then the second most important topic in my book. This may seem like a flip answer, but I don't mean it to be a flip answer to your question, which is a serious question and much broader than the question that you ask. In life, one is frequently asked, what is the most important? So for example, as an environmentalist, I'm often asked, what is the biggest problem facing the world today? Is it climate change? Is it deforestation, overfishing? Is it, et cetera? And my flip answer is the biggest problem facing the world today is our quest to find the biggest problem facing the world today. And I'm serious, because the reality is that there are lots of big problems. In the last chapter of my book, Collapse, I listed what I see as 12 major problems facing the world today, and we got to solve them all, because if we solve 11 of the world's major problems and we don't solve the water problem, we're finished. Or if we solve 11 of the world's major problems and we don't solve the problem of toxic chemicals, we're finished. Similarly, to translate this then to your question about what one can learn from traditional societies, rather than looking at the most important thing and then the second most important thing, traditional societies are, in effect, thousands of natural on how to organize a human society. All human societies have had to deal with children, old age, dangers, health, war, disputes, the whole panoply of human experience. And in principle, we can learn from that whole panoply of human experience in the whole panoply of human societies. I'd rather focus on that rather than focus on the first or the second message.
Hello. I'd like to thank you so much for this book. It's incredibly timely and on a topic that's very close to my heart. I've been learning directly from some teachers of traditional societies, and I'm curious about, it's interesting to learn in a book form about something that's generally an oral and a physical experience. And so I was curious, I'm going to backstep a second. I just want to thank you for bringing this, like translating that kind of wisdom into a book form so people in our culture can hear it and understand it and take it in. But I'm curious about your experiences of learning these things through direct experience, through oral teachings, versus how we learn here. And the importance of listening to people. If you ever do have the honor or opportunity to listen to someone directly, some words about that too, because I'm trying to help get the voice growing, and just it's important to me to hear what you have to say about that. Thank you.
Good question, big questions. Let me take the second half of your question first. How does one learn? In a literate society, we learn especially by reading and now by the internet. And we forget that until the development of writing, and the first writing system was until 3400 BC in the Fertile Crescent, everything that people learned was orally. One learned it by listening to or observing older people. And that has still been the case in traditional New Guinea and in traditional societies generally. In these non-literate societies, one learns from the people with the most experience, the older people. That experience has not been put into a book. Whereas in our literate society, the experience has been put into a book, and a 23-year-old can get it out of a book, and you don't need the older people. So that's the second part of it. And the first part of it, regarding how one learns in traditional societies. Does one learn by oral communication or by observing or by teaching? For me, it's been a mixture of those things. I've learned by watching New Guineans. In some cases, they didn't say anything. I just watched what they did. In some cases, they explained to me explicitly what they were doing and why they were doing it. Some New Guineans have been introspective and have distilled the lessons in a form that I could easily, in a form that I didn't, it was pre-digested. Other important lessons that I learned from New Guineans never summed it up for me. I just observed it. And so, for example, what I was surprised to learn about the nature of friendship in New Guinea, no New Guinean until recently ever explained to me how friendship plays out differently in the United States and in New Guinea. I observed New Guineans dealing with new people that they met, whom in the West we would consider as potential friends, and my New Guinea friend, whom I knew very well, didn't. So that was by observing, and then an educated New Guinea friend explained it to me explicitly. So in short, I've learned there by observing what people do without words, and by listening to what people say, although they may not be introspective about it, and occasionally by their introspection. Yeah.
One follow-up, quick question.
What additionally is gained from going beyond the book, though? Like, what do you, like, the books are a great starting point. I imagine you read some amazing books when you started. But what do you learn when you get beyond the book?
Sure. What do you learn when you get beyond the book? Fortunately, the book has printed 8 pages of further readings, and online about 50 pages of further readings online, with literally hundreds of references. And these references are to the outstanding works of anthropologists and sociologists and travelers who've observed And so if you want to go beyond the book, first of all, you'll have your hands full with 499 pages for a while. If you still have appetite after that, there's an infinite amount to read up on.
One of the things that many people learn in these kinds of circumstances is the value of language itself. I'm curious if you observed and have any anecdotes to tell us about people whose use of speech was so extraordinary in the field.
The use of language itself, a subject dear to my heart. Use of language, what can I say about the use of language? On the one hand, there are New Guineans who are good orators, and they're admired for being good orators, and being good orators means that they're likely to be influential. That's one piece of languages. Another important thing to say about languages is that we in the United States, many, maybe most Americans, are opposed to multilingualism because we think that children growing up hearing two languages from their two parents are going to get confused and that they'll be slower at acquiring language. So we Americans are often hostile to multilingualism, which is weird because among traditional people, it's routine to be multilingual. I personally have never met a New Guinean who spoke fewer than 3 languages. The average New Guinean that I know speaks 5 languages, and once when I did a poll of 20 New Guineans in a campsite, and we just went around the campfire asking how many languages you speak, the lowest number was 5 and the highest number was 15. And these are not dialects like Southern English and the Queen's English. These are different languages as different as are Chinese from Arabic. Languages, and everybody who speaks more than one language, you know that languages enrich your experience. And one of the most surprising single findings that I reported in my book was work within the last 5 years by Ellen Bialystock and colleagues in Toronto, Canada, she's been interested in multilingualism for quite a while, and she was studying together with physicians older people in old people centers in Toronto. And a big fear in old age nowadays is Alzheimer's disease and the other dementias of old age. There's no effective prevention against Alzheimer's disease. People talk about Sudoku and bridge, but the value is debated. The best protection that we know of against Alzheimer's disease, against its symptoms, has emerged just within the last 5 years, and that's been bilingual. Bilingual people get in 5 years of protection against the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And the reason is, it's the same reason why if you work out and do push-ups, you'll develop the muscles of your shoulders. Similarly, if you are constantly exercising your brain, that keeps your brain functioning, and your brain can function reasonably well, even if you have the organic brain damage that comes with Alzheimer's disease. What we don't know, Ellen Bialystock's study shows that being multilingual or bilingual gives you 5 years of protection. But she did not distinguish bilingual from multilingual. What we're waiting to see is whether you get 5 years of protection for each language that you know. If that's the case, then I'm in great shape because with 13 languages, I've got 65 years of protection, but maybe it maxes out at 1 language, and maybe my extra 11 languages do me no good. And we also don't know whether to get that protection you need to learn the language in infancy, say by being a crib bilingual, or whether you get any protection by learning languages in school. I didn't learn my first foreign language until I was 11 years old. And so if you have to learn the languages in infancy to get the protection against Alzheimer's, I'm in bad shape.
You're already over the
I'm over the hill, yeah.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier that traditional societies don't tolerate as much individualism as modern societies in terms of what it means to be a human, what worthy goals are, what virtuous behavior is. But can traditional societies tolerate more individuality in terms of unique expression of one as an individual? And if they can, why is that the case?
Interesting. And I think that I wonder whether that, in fact, might be a good. good question on which to end because it's such an interesting question. The distinction between individuality and individualism. You're correct that individualism, this is really interesting, individualism is prized in the United States. It's less prized in Europe. You know, I've spent a lot of time in Europe, and in Europe there's much more emphasis on the community than on the individual. In Canada, there's more emphasis on the community than on the individual. In traditional societies, there's strong emphasis on the community and less scope for the individual to get ahead. What about individuality, though? Is there any inhibition of individuality? None at all that I can detect in New Guinea. New Guineans, they're as different from each other as are Americans. They're fascinating, they're wonderful, they're in-your-face people. By that I mean that when I'm talking with a New Guinean, he or she is not text messaging, he's not talking on a cell phone, he's not looking over there and looking back to talk with me. It's eyes straight at you, full attention conversation. And it goes on throughout the day, and sometimes it drives me crazy by going on throughout the night. That's one of the things that I find wonderful and fascinating about New Guinea. Perhaps that's a good note on which to end.
Thank you very much, Jared Diamond. You've been listening to Cambridge Forum, co-sponsored by the First Parish Church in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For more information about this program entitled The World Until Yesterday, recorded in January 2013, featuring Jared Diamond, or for more information about us and future programs, visit us on the World Wide Web at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Tim Weiskell. Thank you very much for joining us. Cambridge Forum's next public program takes place on Tuesday, February 5th, when we host author Christoph Imscher discussing his new biography of Louis Agassiz, the controversial and charismatic figure who created the modern practice of science in America. The program is here in the Meeting House at First Parish Church at 7 p.m. on the 5th of February. I hope you can all join us then. Now, there are books for sale, and if you'd like Jared Diamond to sign them, please make a line in the outside aisle. Move that way, come down forward, and he will sign them at the table here. Sign, but he can't write dedications to your great-grandmother, I'm afraid. So, thank you very much for joining us.